I am Muchaneta to Napel, and this is Fashion Politics podcast. You are listening to episode 1, and I've got a really amazing guest to start off the podcast. Her name is Sinmisoluwa Adesanya. I don't know if I've said that correctly, but hopefully I have. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're most welcome. I'm really a big fan of your work, Simi. I've seen some of the stuff that you've posted on LinkedIn and also some of the papers that you've written as well. I've read some of them. I'm into reading papers right now. Forget books. I'm all about papers, especially with the new legislations that are coming into play at the moment in Europe. So I kind of fangirled you a little bit and found out what your account was, and I contacted you, and I'm so happy that you were able to find a moment to talk with me about what's going on in Africa as the whole continent, what's going on in terms of fashion industry, what's going on in terms of legislation, education. So let's get started. When it comes to Africa's fashion industry, can you give us a little bit of background knowledge about, where it's coming from, where it's headed, and where it currently is at the moment?
That's a great question. I think it's a perfect foundation to, kind of understanding the legal nuances of it as well. For Africa's fashion industry, it's not the same as we've seen in the global north, right? It's more of like a bunch of local networks. So, people just recently started setting up brands, going international and trying to make a name for themselves on the continent and in the diaspora as well. So, when you come to the fashion industry in Africa, it's more of, everyone has this relationship with their tailor or seamstress. So you don't really go to brands to purchase stuff, or, you don't kind of get people to purchase some of these products. It's mostly going to your tailor and saying, oh, I have this fabric, would you help me sew this style? And you wait for a while, they customize it, and then if there are any adjustments to make, they'll do that, give it back to you, and so forth. So the relationship is not the same as we've seen with other brands. In the global north, is people going to brands, buying stuff already made to their size. If there's any complaints, there's already channels for returns and so forth. But in Africa, it's not the same. And then, there's also the prevalence of secondhand clothing. So most people that do sew clothes don't sew clothes to wear to work or anything. It's mostly for festivities and things like that. So when you want to wear clothes for work, you mostly buy them. People buy them from abroad, or, just also have secondhand clothing shipped in. They go to their local markets and then buy that. So that's kind of where Africa's industry is at. But moving forward now, we're seeing the rise of brands like Tebe Mugugu, Andrea Yama, Rich Mincy, Orange Culture. There's so many of them now. And I'm sure within the next few years, we're going to see more people keen into that sort of structure of, being more focused on the business of the brand as opposed to just designing fashion.
See, I find that rather interesting, because that kind of old school way of purchasing a garment and, going to somebody with the material and saying, hey, I would like you to make a design like this. And then they do the measurements, and then they take some time creating something that's personalized to you. This sounds like something that brands here in Europe are trying to go back to.
Yeah.
And in Africa, it sounds like they are going more towards how we do ththings in Europe, where you walk into a shop and you buy something. It's not customized to you, it's not personalized, but it's something that is, something that the brand sells.
Yeah. Well,
that's very interesting. I mean, I think the reason why a lot of brands here in Europe are trying to swap how they do business is to do with sustainability. I'm curious, what's the conversation about being more sustainable as a fashion brand in Africa, as a whole, as an entire continent? Is it something that's being tackled, or is it something that is not really taking center stage at the moment?
Oh, okay. That's a great question because this is one of the major conversations when it comes to African fashion. And it's the fact that because of the industry is still largely made up of local networks, you don't see people with big brands and, deep supply chains and manufacturing plants and so forth. It's just people in their shops sewing and, probably delivering it to you or you coming to take it from their shops and things like that. So when it comes to sustainability, the impact of the fashion industry in Africa isn't that much. I'm not sure where I read it, but Africa's fashion industry actually contributes the least to environmental damage when it was gauged against fashion industries in other continents. So when it comes to sustainability for Africa, it's quite interesting because an opportunity presents itself whereby in Europe, like you said, most fashion brands are trying to actually inculcate sustainability into their practices. But with Africa, we've seen that it's something that has actually been practiced for, time immemorial, in the sense that even when, local artisans are making clothes, dyeing and things like that, they don't necessarily use chemicals. They go to plant dyes and everything is handmade, not even with machines and things like that. So those sort of practices have naturally been interwoven into Africa's fashion industry. So the conversation around sustainability is entirely different when you look at the African fashion industry.
I think we can learn a lot from you guys in terms of things, because
Yeah.
it seems like, a lot that's going on here in the West is about how can we go back to how we used to do things? How can we go back to where customers can respect their garments, own something that is well made for you, so you can wear it for generations. I mean, my mother has clothes from the 70s still,
Exactly.
So talking about fashion, and you mentioned this earlier, the second-hand market in Africa. I've heard more that it's not a good thing for the West to be sending all their used garments to the continent. I mean, is it a thriving business model for Africa, or would you say that that the West needs to kind of find a way of dealing more with its own garment waste rather than sending it over?
Okay. It's actually I think you touched on the two sides of the argument. On the one hand, the second-hand market actually provides affordable clothing for low-income consumers, right? We're not able to afford new clothing, so this actually helps people have access to basic necessities. But on the other hand, the secondhand market is also having negative impact in the sense that the clothes that are coming into the continent are actually too much. So even though they are, cheap clothing and there's demand for them, there's still too much import, and then that ends up, going into waste, landfills and so forth, which obviously negatively impacts the environment. So from a legal standpoint, it raises questions about import regulations, custom duties and other trade related issues. So I think what we're seeing now is that more people are calling for governments to consider policies that actually balance this need to provide affordable clothing with the need to protect the local industries and then the environment. Another issue that people may not entirely see when it comes to secondhand clothing is the fact that because so many people are used to it on the continent, I mean, when you go to Nigeria, Ghana, Ethiopia, Kenya, Rwanda, like secondhand clothing is huge in these countries. So it stifles the local fashion industry in the sense that when fashion designers end up making clothes that they've labored over and then want to sell them, because of the high price point, people that are used to buying these low cost products and clothing items are not entirely willing to pay such a high amount from what they're used to. And that way fashion designers in the industry are being impacted negatively. And then there's also concerns about the safety and quality of secondhand clothing. And that's just to say that because it's already been used, the quality isn't as great in the first place. So people tend to use it for lesser time before they dispose it. So now, I think from a legal standpoint, right, people are, more stakeholders are calling for governments to regulate not just the amount of secondhand clothing being imported, but also the quality of the clothing that is being imported. So yeah, in general, I think the secondhand clothing market represents both opportunities and challenges, and it would just be how governments, create regulations and policies around this that will, determine how the market would impact the industry from here.
I think it's interesting that the government can actually play a key role within the fashion industry as a whole, because a lot of the industry, especially in the West, they very much been used to self-regulating themselves, to setting their own rules. So if the government now is stepping in, I think a lot of the fashion industry is running for the hills. They're not quite sure what this means. It's kind of like giving a spoiled child rules. They're allowed to do anything they want, but now Mama has come and set the rules. There's no more, to hear no further. And I can just see like a lot of brands being really unsure or uncertain about what the next steps are going to be. So when it comes to the relevance of policy, what kind of policy do you see coming forward in terms of African fashion? I mean, you mentioned that putting things into place so secondhand clothes don't, they have a space, but not take over the space. What other regulations, what other legislations do you hope to see being put into place in order to help the African fashion industry thrive?
Oh, that's a great question, because there's a couple of issues, right? Especially when it comes to African fashion and policy. So I think the first would be the protection of traditional designs, right? And we've seen a couple of instances where there's been cases of cultural appropriation, right? And African fashion is often inspired by these traditional patterns and symbols that have a lot of cultural and historical significance. So in order to prevent the exploitation and misappropriation of these designs, there will need to be laws and policies that can be put in place to provide legal protection of these designs and symbols. I think the major argument that I've seen around this is, whether there should be a continent-wide protection for these designs, or it should be region-based. So, there would be a certain body for protecting these designs in West Africa, another in South Africa, Central Africa, and so forth. So, I think now legal stakeholders are ideating around this space to see what would be best. Then the next is the support for local production. And this, policies and laws around this. And this is because when it comes to Africa, one of the reasons why it's so hard to actually build a fashion brand is because manufacturing is very difficult. So before you source the materials where you manufacture and then transport to, the final consumer, it's just not there. So there's a lack of infrastructure. So I know some countries are already doing things in this regard, like Ethiopia and South Africa. South Africa recently released its master plan for the textile industry, which includes policies that are aimed at manufacturing. And Ethiopia is actually considered one of the largest hubs for manufacturing on the continent. So it would be about governments in other countries, taking note of what these countries are doing, and then also ensuring they're putting laws and policies in place. So ensuring that they also include incentives for local production and import duties, especially with agreements like the AFCFTA, as the African Free Trade and Continental Agreement. Then policies around sustainability as well. Just like I mentioned before, I think for Africa, when it comes to developing its industry, we don't necessarily face the same problems as we've seen in the global north. And that's because the industry is just developing. So it's ensuring that as we're enacting these policies and laws, we're also we're putting preventive policies in place, right? So that we actually do not have a recurrence of what we've already seen in other continents, right? It's more about ensuring that the sustainable practices we already have, we are looking for ways to double down on that and then duplicate it and let it work on a much larger scale. Then there's, I think IP protection also falls within the protection of um, um, local cultural and symbols and marks, right? Then there's also consumer protection. And this is because with the development of the industry, obviously there will be more people engaging with these fashion brands to purchase products and things like that. So to prevent the exploitation of consumers and, kind of mitigate some of the disputes that may arise, there will need to be laws and policies that would be put in place to protect consumers and promote transparency within the fashion industry. So those are some of the laws I see, that will be majorly put in place in the next few years.
I'm so happy to hear that, that a lot of these countries in Africa are being so proactive when it comes to the industry, when it comes to protecting their brands, their businesses. In your opinion, do you think that the continent has a seat at the table of decisions that are going on right now within the fashion space? Because like I said earlier, I went to COP27 and I felt there was a lot of talk about climate change and how the fashion industry is playing a role in that, but there was not so much of an inclusion of many African brands who I saw at the seat of the table. Do you see this as something that can be solved, a problem to be solved, or do you think that actually they do have a seat at the table? Their voices are just not being heard as loud.
Oh, that's a great one, Muchaneta. And I agree with you. I don't believe that our voices are being heard enough. To an extent, I would say it's just within the recent years that have gone by that, we've seen more African inclusion within these conversations. Prior to that, there was no inclusion at all, which meant that these solutions that were being framed, even the laws and policies that were supposed to apply globally regarding legal protection, for example, IP, we have the TRIPS agreement and it's for trademarks, right? So some of these laws and policies that were previously enacted didn't take into consideration the African context. And that was because Africa wasn't even part of the conversation to begin with. And, but now we're seeing more and more of that when with the events and seminars, summits, and conferences and so forth, we're seeing more inclusion of the African perspective, but it still needs to be more because our voices are still not being heard enough. So yeah, I do agree.
I mean, I kind of noticed as well that a lot of events have started popping up to discuss various things going on within the fashion industry and also talking about the policy and legislation and so forth. I mean, what events would you recommend that people keep their eye on in order to be kept informed of what's going on in Africa?
Oh, okay. There's a couple. Last year, I think it was in November or so, there was the US Africa Summit, and it was mostly to negotiate about the AGOA, that's the African Growth and Opportunity Act. And that act is basically an agreement that was entered between America and then East African states just to ensure that there's, they're incentivizing free trade, so low import and export duties on certain materials, including fashion items, right? So that agreement is quite important for the fashion industry. And last year there was a summit, and that's because stakeholders were coming together to kind of ideate around what should the agreement look like moving forward, because the agreement is going to come to an end in 2025. And I would say that events like these are some that should be attended. There's others like, there's the Fashion Law Africa Summit. It happens yearly. So that's another good event. I would say, I'm trying to think. I know the Commonwealth does organize yearly symposiums, right? And also summits as well that focus on the fashion industry in Africa. So that those are good ones to attend as well. But yeah, I think those are some.
Another suggestion is they just need to follow you on LinkedIn, because you're always sharing content.
Yes.
And you're always sharing what's going on, So yeah, I mean, I would say definitely for people need to follow you in order to kind of keep up with what's going on. Let's talk about education, which is something that is a big topic here in Europe, because of the fact that a lot of people believe that the fashion education at the moment is outdated. It's not focused on innovation and the change that is taking place right now. And it's really important that the students that are being educated in this particular space understand what it means to be sustainable, what technology is available to help them reach the sustainability goal, understand new materials, understand their supply chain, the importance of that, and the technology blockchain that's available. How is education going in Africa in terms of fashion? Is there particular direction that it's headed in? Do a lot of fashion students come to Europe or America for their education? Or are we seeing a growth in fashion education on the continent?
Oh, great question. That's another great question. And I think before I start, I'll just make a reference to CF, right? That's the Council for International African Fashion Education. And I mean, I work with the organization and they're doing a lot of great things in this regard. They also share a lot of opportunities and events. So just like you follow me on LinkedIn, please follow, because you'll be getting a lot of information there. So
and when they do some great papers, sorry to interrupt, but they also I'm going to add my little 10 cents. I read some of the papers that they have on their website, and they're really good reads, and they're informative, to the point, and you kind of leave with something. You know, when you read an article, sometimes you leave with nothing. But when you read those papers, you download them, you actually get so much out of them. It kind of arouses your curiosity. So yes, I second that completely. But yes, let's talk education. Your thoughts, please.
Okay, thank you. So when it comes to African fashion education, right, there is a huge knowledge gap. And that's because fashion on the continent hasn't been entirely taken seriously like other, disciplines. And that's like, if I'm going to trace it back to the roots, it's because from the colonial times, right, Black men and women were mostly in charge of farming, making clothes, fixing clothes, cooking, and things like that. So when it came to making clothes, it was seen as, something that everyone can do. Your mom can do it. You saw your mom while you were growing up sewing something, she could easily fix up your clothes and things like that. So when you do even look at most African fashion designers and you read their stories, you hear that their inspiration for fashion came from either their mom, their aunt, and people like that. So, everyone kind of had this basic understanding of what fashion is, and it was mostly meant for women, right? And people didn't really give it as much regard as it should have been given. So, people naturally didn't see the need to include fashion education in the curriculum in the first place, because it's like, oh, everyone knows it. It's a skill you should have. Women can do it and things like that. So now that, more people are being aware of the potential that the industry holds to actually generate income and to generate revenue rather, and revolutionize, economies and industries, it's more attention is being paid to that. But that is a reason why there's a gap when it comes to fashion education. It wasn't taken seriously initially, so it wasn't included in the curriculum. But now, because of that huge knowledge gap, we're actually seeing a lot of people come up to kind of close the gap. So schools, hubs, schools like, Stadio Fedisa, Dakar Design Hub in Senegal. We have the Joyce Obabio College in Ghana. We have innovation hubs like the Assembly in Nigeria. There's so many of them, right? And even CF is doing a lot in this regard as well. And now it's just about ensuring that we're creating a a holistic curriculum for fashion education, and not just bringing that Eurocentric view. Because when we did take a survey to look at the fashion curriculum of fashion schools, we saw that, everything still kind of had a Eurocentric kind of flavor to them, and it wasn't necessarily tailored for learners on the continent. So fashion education has that gap, first in the sense that not too many people are engaging, even though we're seeing more people come up. And then second, in the fact that the curriculum that is currently being used is Eurocentric. So we need to overhaul that and put a new one. So education moving forward now, based on the attention that is getting now, would be, to promote innovation, right? We're seeing a lot of people come up with incredible ways to promote sustainability, use technology. I mean, there's hubs like Baum Labs in Ghana, Stadio as well, they're including technological fashion courses in their curriculum. More schools are partnering with designers and industry professionals to train students, not just educate them, and promote sustainability. So yeah,
that's so exciting to hear, because it's very easy for you to take a template from another part of the world and use that as this is how we're going to run our course. But there's something wrong with that education system too. So to adopt it is to just basically carry on the problems that we are currently facing with our fashion education right now. But I have found that there is room for change, and I feel like a lot. I lecture at a university, and I lecture on innovation and fashion. And I have found the university to be so open to the change, which is a very hard thing for something that's been established for a long time, And one thing I think a lot of the students are learning, that you have to learn to evolve.
Yeah.
You cannot be the same year 1 as you are in year 10 as you are in year 20.
Very true.
Which is something that people get so comfortable being what they are, designing the same old, that they don't move with the times, because they don't see what's wrong with how they do business.
Yeah.
You understand? So it's kind of nice to hear that, there are countries in Africa taking that initiative to try and teach their students different ways of doing it, and also keeping up the heritage of the country. Because it's fashion, it's the fashion industry that needs to change, not fashion itself. So it's important to learn the skills of how to sew, and the understanding of where materials are coming from, and designs and the history behind it. So it's very exciting to hear you say that. But taking it all back again to policy, I'm kind of curious to know, is there anything that is coming into play in the next 12 months that the industry needs to be aware of?
When you say coming into play, do you mean regarding the industry or education, or both?
Or both, yes. For example, here in the UK, they just started, not the UK, in Europe. The UK is no longer part of the EU. I forget. I'm still thinking we're part of the EU. No, we're not. In Europe, they've kind of announced this need for a digital passport. They've announced this need for companies to be able to showcase exactly what their product is made out of. They're trying to eliminate greenwashing. So there's a lot going on in the next 12 to 24 months in Europe in terms of legislation and putting into place laws that the industry needs to abide by. So my question to you was, are there any laws that you are aware of that are going to be coming into play? So people know that, okay, if I'm going to do business in Africa, I need to make sure that I have all my ducks lined up when it comes to materials, or when it comes to how I trade, or where I trade, or anything like that. Is there anything that's going on right now, or is it something that's going to most likely happen in the future, but not yet?
That's a great question as well. I love the questions, only because, I think they provide people with a very robust understanding of how the
Mm,
industry and education are. So I
mm,
think first, with regards to education, right, you already mentioned the fact that some of these international institutions are quite open to changing the way things have been done. And that is the trend that we've been seeing, right? People are more open to decolonizing fashion, and not just on the African continent, but internationally as well. And that's because, we do have Africans that go abroad to study, and other times it's the international students that come to the continent. So just ensuring that no matter where you're educated regarding fashion, you're learning from a very robust and holistic curriculum, right? So I do think that in the next few years, we're going to see policies and regulations around that decolonization in fashion education. And then for the industry, I would say trade is a big, big, big topic now in Africa's fashion industry, and that's because of agreements like the AFCFTA, and that's the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. So the agreement basically provides for, a one market system within Africa. So you can literally be in Togo and then, transporting your goods to countries in West Africa wouldn't be difficult, only because all countries on the continent are part of that agreement, and they would ensure low tariffs for import and export, and also provide more employment for people. So I would say if you're looking to do business in the fashion industry within the next few years, that's definitely an agreement to take note of. There's been a lot of deliberations on it to see how best to implement it, and ensure that it creates more, like, it improves trade on the continent, right? There's other regional agreements, just like I've mentioned, the African Growth and Opportunity Act regarding East African states. So if you're thinking of doing business in East Africa, that's definitely one to take note of. There's also intellectual property agreements like the OAPI and the ARIPO as well. So that's just organizations that oversee intellectual property for certain countries that sign the agreements. So if you're thinking of how to protect your designs in these countries, I would highly suggest that you do a search and see if the country you're planning to establish your business in is a part of that agreement. But the legal system in Africa is quite jurisdictional, right? Just like it is everywhere else. So it depends on the country that you're operating in, and the laws that they have for the fashion industry, that those laws would largely determine what you're able to do, and how you can trade within the countries. So different countries on the continent have their laws relating to intellectual property, trade, consumer protection, data privacy. So it's just ensuring that you're taking note of those laws in whatever regions your businesses or businesses are in, to ensure that you're compliant. Yeah.
I mean, that's quite a lot, and I'm really excited to hear that. It seems to me that, that a lot of the countries in Africa are really, even though their voices are not so easily heard, they are still being part of the solution.
Yes.
They're still trying to kind of like make sure that they are not going to suffer the effect of not acting at the point that they need to act. So this is really superb to actually learn that, and also quite encouraging. But what are your thoughts on collaboration? Because a lot of change that's been happening for the fashion industry in the West has been really based on collaborating, industry collaborations, because the fashion industry, doesn't know a lot about how they can make that change. So they're really relying on networking, knowledge sharing, and the kind of that collaboration of industries. Is that something that's also happening in different countries in Africa, this need to kind of collaborate?
Oh, yes, 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 of course. And I think just right before I go into this question, I just have one more point to make regarding the
Yes,
last, and
please.
that's the fact that intellectual property is also being taken quite seriously. So a couple of countries have started reviewing their intellectual property laws. So within the next few years, that's another trend that would be really, really big. I know Nigeria has done that, so Africa, Zimbabwe as well. So some of these countries are reviewing their laws in order to ensure that in the coming years, for the growth of the fashion industry, there's also sufficient protection for designers within the industry. But yeah, going back to your question regarding collaboration, right? I think collaboration is essential for fashion schools and even brands on the continent. And that's because there's so much to learn about the industry. And what you'll find when you interact with people is that some academics, they know certain facts about the history of fashion. They could know more about sustainability and things like that. But these brand owners, they also are aware of some of these practices. Like I said, most of them learned or got inspired to work in the industry based on watching someone much older in their life also engage in fashion. So it could be sewing, dyeing, and things like that. So there's a lot of knowledge that they have to give. But, if they're not within the academic space, it's quite hard to, translate that knowledge. So I think collaboration between fashion education stakeholders and the industry professionals is quite essential in developing the industry on the continent, right? And also internationally, when we talk about efforts such as decolonization and cultural appropriation, it's only through education that some of these institutions can learn about how they are able to incorporate some of these knowledge into their teaching materials, also translate that into the kind of staff that they hire, and who gets what positions in these institutions. So I think collaboration presents a lot of unique opportunities to actually grow the fashion industry in Africa and in the diaspora as well, in the continent, in other continents.
One thing I was listening to what you're saying, and one thing I wanted to also touch on was social responsibility. How seriously has the African fashion industry is taking social responsibility and environmental impact with regards to the fashion industry?
Oh yeah, I think it's quite serious here as well, only because we're also learning, just because we're of the age that we're in, technology is easy to easily read the news and figure out what's happening in other parts of the world. So I think from learning about the impact that the growth of the fashion industry and other continents have had, it's policy stakeholders and even just government industry professionals, when you do engage with them, you hear them say things like they are trying to inculcate sustainability into their brands from the start. So most of them won't even start the business except it's sustainable. At least I've spoken to a couple of people who have that mindset, right? Which is why when you look at the types of brands that we really have emerging from the continent, you see that they're brands that are quite passionate about social responsibility. So producing ethically, using the right practices, materials, hiring people. So there's that awareness because of the exposure. And yeah, everyone is taking notes to ensure that regardless of whatever role they play in the industry, they're, putting a very, very high importance to social responsibility. Yeah.
That is really something, because it sounds to me, after all these things that you're talking about, legislation, talking about how education and this need to kind of preserve the heritage of African fashion, the economic development, how important you are taking when it comes to environmental impact and social responsibility. It sounds to me like the West needs to look to Africa about how to get things done. Because it sounds like, because you are going down the right steps. This need to work with government, this need to work with other industries, and to put certain values in how you do business within fashion, which is super important, which is something that over here we are learning to do or trying to implement into our business models, because it doesn't come naturally. Before, it was all about money, how we're going to make more money, which I haven't even heard you mention once in our conversation is that word money. Normally, you've mentioned many other key terms, but never said to me like, listen, we want to make money.
Yeah. And I think this just goes back to your point regarding including Africa in these conversations, because there's so much to learn, right? I'm sure that there's a lot we can learn from the global north, and there's a lot they can learn from us as well. So and I think it speaks back to collaboration, right? With more engagement and collaboration, we'll see that it would, there would be a lot more innovative solutions towards bringing the fashion industry towards that, sustainably and responsibly operated industry. Yeah.
I think the message here is that Africa has something important to add to the solutions, and that the West does not need to carry the burden on their own. They do not have to have that savior mentality.
Yeah.
That it's a global problem. So everyone from every corner of the planet really play a key role in bringing change. It should not depend on one part of the world to be the solution providers, especially since you are basically saying that, hey, we're also trying to figure this out. Let's all work together. So what are your final key takeaways from the conversation today? What do you want people to say? Okay, I heard what she has to say, and this is what I'm taking away from it.
Oh, okay. That's a great question. I would say the first is closing the knowledge and skills gap. And whether you're in industry or in the industry, or you're in the education of the educational aspect of the fashion industry, you should take note that there's a gap to close. So whatever you have to offer, please collaborate, engage in conversations, right? And do as much as possible to create positive change. Then I would say the next is the wave. There's going to be a wave of, new legislation and policies focused on the fashion industry, especially, I wouldn't say especially in Africa. I think we're seeing more of that pop up everywhere. But yes, in the next few years with Africa, there's going to be a lot more focus on regulating the fashion industry than, with issues such as second-hand market, the second-hand clothing market in Africa. We're seeing more people, taking note of how they are consuming fashion and what it really means to regulate the industry in Africa. So I would say that, in the next few years, we're going to see more regulation in that regard as well. So a few key trends to know for Africa: there's going to be a promotion of local talent. Education is going to be big. There's going to be investment in infrastructure and protection of intellectual property. And also, this awareness of social responsibility as we're aiming to move the industry forward.
I think that those are some wonderful points to end our conversation, Simi. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me and to educate me.
I feel really so much
educated now. But you know what it is? It's not even that I feel educated. Let me correct myself. I feel that you have aroused my curiosity further, and that I actually want to find out more. And that's what it is. And that's what it is, right? It's about arousing people's curiosity so they want to learn more. And they want to, for example, reach out to you and say, hey, Simi, how can we work together? Use my talents. What can we do to make things change? So I invite you all to connect with Simi on LinkedIn. She is super approachable. She is super happy to talk to everyone and anyone. Yeah. And let's continue this conversation. I'm definitely looking forward to us having a part 2 to kind of look at what actions have taken place and where are we going into the future in terms of bringing an entire continent to the table of conversation.